Hello everybody and welcome to the GCSE Geography live stream, or in fact it's not exactly a live stream, it's pre-recorded, which means I can't exactly respond to your chat replays. However, if you do have any comments, I will respond to them very promptly. So in this video, we're going to be looking at exam question mania. So we're going to be going through a bunch of exam questions which I've prepared for you. And it's going to help you revise through all of the content, or the vast majority of the content, and make you very well prepared. So I've made a resource for you guys, which you can access via my website. So if you press on the website link, which should be in the description box, and scroll down to GCSE resources and geography, you should be able to find the PDF, which contains the practice exam questions, which I will be going through in this video. We're going through the answers, going through how to answer them, etc. So just pause this video and make sure you access that. And now let's begin by answering them. So section A, the challenges of natural hazards. Now I said this video is useful for any exam board, and that is very true. So even though the content is organized in terms of 3 sections like the AQA specification, it's useful for any exam board. Okay, so here are some 4-mark questions. Let's begin by looking at the first one. So explain how volcanic activity and orbital changes can cause climate change. Okay, so this might be a tricky question at first if you're thinking about it, but you need to think about how these 2 natural factors can cause climate change. So pause the video to have a go. If not, let's review the answers. So, orbital changes. Orbital changes affect the solar radiation doses that the Earth receives. Also, if there's changes in the tilt, wobble, or stretch of the Earth's orbit, that will then change the length of the glacial and interglacial periods. And this is literally climate change. You only needed to put one of those points and then explain it. Okay, and for the volcanic activity portion of the question, we know that large volcanic eruptions can emit a huge amount of debris, and this actually causes global cooling as it reduces the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth's atmosphere because the debris is blocking it. Or, on the other hand, it releases water vapor, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide, which causes global warming. Both of them are climate change, so we shouldn't just associate global warming with climate change. Global cooling is also an example of climate change. Okay, let's look at the next one. Explain how planting trees and using renewable energy can mitigate climate change. So here we've just focused on planting trees, but we should have also spoken about renewable energy, but that's fine. So mitigation is effectively reducing the causes of climate change. So they said mitigation because another strategy for climate change is adaptation, adapting to the new changes rather than trying to prevent them from happening. So planting trees decreases the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through photosynthesis. You need to make sure you say photosynthesis. Even though it's not biology, you need to mention this process, where it is absorbed. It also increases the oxygen supply, which is good for other wildlife and propagating that. And then for renewable energy, you could talk about solar energy and wind energy. Looking at the next question, explain the formation of a tropical storm. Now, there's a lot of steps to this question, so we need to really think about how to break the process down. Have a go, and let's now go through it. So, the first thing that you should always mention is that tropical storms usually form between 5 and 30 degrees latitude. Now, this isn't temperature. This is talking about the position in terms of the Earth and the equator, so how far from the equator that this is happening. So 5 to 30 degrees is quite close to the equator. Why is it happening at the equator? Because that's the hottest part of the Earth, where the Earth is receiving the greatest amount of solar radiation from the sun. Okay, the next step. When the ocean surface water reaches at least 27 degrees Celsius because of the sun heating it, the warm air above the water rises quickly, and this creates an area of very low pressure. Remember, low pressure, warm air rises. As the air rises quickly, more warm, moist air is drawn upwards. It's like if you've studied in biology the transpiration stream. When water is going up a plant, it's pulling at it. So the same similar thing is happening here. Water is being drawn upwards above the ocean, creating very strong winds. The rising warm air spirals upwards, but eventually, as it's going upwards, it will cool. And then the water vapor carries and condenses down to form cumulonimbus clouds, which is another word for thunderclouds. So these thunderclouds then form the eye wall of the storm. Now, key thing to remember, whether you call it tropical storm, hurricane, typhoon, all of these are the exact same thing. They just have different names depending on where in the world it's affecting the countries. Now, obviously, this is a lot of detail, so it's unlikely that they're going to require all of this detail. There are loads of different bullet points here. They just want the key ideas. Okay, explain how human activity can lead to an increase in climate change. So we need to think, okay, we've looked at natural causes in the first question, so now we have to look at the many different human causes. Burning fossil fuels, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide are released due to coal, oil, and gas. Agriculture, livestock releases a lot of methane, especially when we're talking about cattle farming. There's a lot of soil erosion. Deforestation, a major human cause, removing the carbon sinks of the world. Cement production, and just generally production of different things. Transportation, overconsumption of goods, and trade. Now we're moving on to the 6 markers. So let's look at the first one. Explain how the effects of tectonic hazards vary between areas of contrasting wealth. So what this question is asking is for you to draw out your knowledge from your example that you've learnt, whether it's New Zealand versus Nepal, or it's an example using Italy, or anything like that. So what you need to do is you need to discuss the primary effects and the secondary effects. So I've given some examples of the effects which actually are applicable to the New Zealand versus Nepal example. For example, primary effects: death, destruction of homes, destruction of transport links, etc. Secondary effects include floods, landslides, tsunamis, avalanches, disease outbreaks. Let's now move on to the second one. Explain how plate boundaries can cause tectonic hazards. Now, hopefully you would have learnt about tectonic hazards and plate boundaries. This is where some specifications differ. So I believe Edexcel requires you to know a lot more about the plate boundaries. AQA is a lot less specific. They want you to know about the general movements of them, but they won't really ask you too much about it. But I would still say revise it. So looking at this question, we've got convergent, divergent, and conservative plate boundaries. So convergent plate boundaries are known as destructive. So if you actually watch my geography video about this, I think it was quite good because the animations really show it. So they're destructive. You've got 2 plates hitting each other, they're moving towards each other. Now, in this case, we're talking about oceanic and continental. The reason why we're talking about different is because they have different densities. So as they move towards one another, this will cause an earthquake because what happens is subduction. So subduction is when one plate is forced below another plate, and this then leads to the formation of volcanoes as you have a little lava pool or magma pool. Now, if you have a destructive plate boundary, but both the plates are the same, so it's 2 continental or 2 oceanic, and they have the same density, then they're not going to subduct because which one will do it first? So instead, they actually don't move down, they move upwards, and the plates buckle and form fold mountains. So that explains the formation of mountains. Now looking at divergent, or otherwise known as constructive plate boundaries. So these plates move apart from one another. They form or construct a shield volcano as that magma rises to fill that gap, forming a volcano. This is actually how a lot of underwater volcanoes form. And therefore, there can be a lot of earthquakes as the two plates are moving away from each other. They could be colliding with other plates as well. And finally, conservative plate boundaries. This is a bit of an anomaly because this one doesn't actually create any volcanoes. What's happening here is plates are moving side by side in different directions, or they could be moving in the same direction but at different speeds. Now, as they're doing this, they're creating friction because they're not going to be entirely smooth, are they? And therefore, they create friction and then eventually they get stuck. And at some point or another, they're then going to get unstuck as they move past each other. This then sends out massive shock waves, creating earthquakes. Okay, that was a really in-depth response, and that's what they're kind of looking for a 6 marker. Moving on to the 9 markers. So I'm only going to answer one 9 marker here because there's a lot to choose from, and I think this one seems to be the most realistic for the exam. So, to what extent are immediate responses more important than long-term responses when dealing with tectonic hazards? So, start off with a table. Obviously, you're not going to write your response in a table, but it's much more easier to convey information to you guys in that way. So, you're arguing on the left-hand side, immediate responses are more important, and on the right-hand side, long-term responses are more important. So, you have to come up with your own points and understanding, but what you do is you need to supplement your points with statistics from the examples that you've learned. Okay, the first point I've said is that for immediate responses being more important, evacuating people will save lives. And this is the priority in any event that could happen. An example of this would be that in New Zealand, 200 of the most vulnerable people were evacuated prior to this. So this immediate response could have saved the lives of 200 of the most vulnerable people. Another immediate response, treating the injured. This could prevent unnecessary death and the transmission of diseases. So the transmission of diseases is actually a secondary effect. So you can talk about how immediate responses can actually limit not just primary but also secondary effects so that you won't have to have long-term responses. Another immediate response is foreign governments or charities providing aid. And you need to, if you're mentioning this point, you need to emphasize that this is really instrumental when looking at low-income countries, countries that are unable to provide their own aid because already they are quite poor and poverty-stricken, and therefore they are reliant on the help of other countries. For example, Nepal relied on the immediate aid from other BRICS, like India and China. Without their help, God knows how many lives would have been lost, more than that. Okay, so really emphasize how it impacts the poverty-stricken countries. Now, long-term are more important. Let's look at some reasons why. So repairing and reconstructing housing is an important issue. Is important because a huge homeless population is a big problem. After the Nepal event, unfortunately, 1 million people were left homeless. Okay, and reconstructing their housing then became the next priority. Improving forecasting, prediction, and monitoring technologies. This is an important long-term response because it will then reduce the future primary and secondary effects of future events. This can then massively ensure that the country is safe. For example, Japan is impeccable at doing so. Japan has improved their forecasting, prediction, and monitoring to such an apt level that every day when they're experiencing these different tsunamis, these earthquakes, because they lie geographically on a lot of plate boundaries. So that's why Japan is very susceptible to lots of different hazards, tectonic hazards. But a train being late is more likely to come up on the news than a tsunami happening in Japan. And that really highlights how they've managed to deal with the problem in such an efficient way. And finally, looking at our next point, boosting economic recovery. That is an important long term response, encouraging tourism, because you need to gather revenue for the reconstruction. And why do economies need money? Well, so that their country doesn't go into starvation, so that their country has healthcare, for many, many reasons. Okay, and that is the end of section A. Well done, guys, you've got this far. We're now going to look at section B, the living world. Beginning with some 4 markers. So explain how ecotourism helps manage the rainforest sustainably. So ecotourism is one of the best responses for looking at deforestation, and if you studied the Amazon or perhaps any other rainforest, you would understand why, and you'd hopefully be able to apply some of your figures to this. Let's look at the answer. So, the money generated by ecotourism is invested back into conservation projects that retain and protect the rainforest trees. This benefits the government and the local people. This is a more sustainable option than cutting them down for short term profit. Another useful thing is that it provides the people who've worked in deforestation alternative jobs and a means to survival. Because a big issue was when countries were telling Brazil and Amazonian countries to stop deforestation, everybody was thinking, but what about all of the people whose jobs, whose livelihoods rely on the money that they receive? And therefore, this is a really good solution because it's an alternate way of making money. And therefore, it's providing them a solution rather than just getting rid of their livelihoods. The next question, explain the role of producers in an ecosystem. So producers are organisms that produce food for themselves and other organisms. They make organic compounds via photosynthesis, don't forget that. And via the food chain, all other organisms rely on the greenery and the plantation and the foliage as their source of food. Therefore, the stability of producers is vital to ecosystems because all organisms need organic molecules, specifically carbon. Okay, and the last 4 marker for section B, explain how a small scale ecosystem that you've studied can be affected by a local change. So you can talk about extreme weather events such as heat waves and droughts. These can cause devastation to small-scale ecosystems. For example, ponds may dry out. Or a more human factor. For example, a new manufacturing company coming in and therefore polluting the rivers. This can harm the local wildlife within the river and massively shift the dynamics of the food chain. And now moving on to the 6 markers for section B. So we're only going to look at one of them because obviously the previous 2 are linking to what we've looked at, and I want you guys to have more of a go at these questions. So looking at the impacts of rainforest deforestation. Now there's quite a few. So soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, climate change, economic development. You do not have to mention all of them to get 6 marks. I would say that you only need to mention 2 of them and just explain them in depth. However, if you're unable to explain them in depth, then try and mention at least, or at most, 3. So soil erosion. Once the land is cleared of rainforest vegetation, the soil is left bare. So when it rains, the nutrients in the soil are washed away. The nutrient cycle stops because there are no plants or trees shedding leaves to replace the nutrients in the soil. The soil is no longer able to support plant life because it's not fertile. This then means that nothing will grow there, and that is really bad. Loss of biodiversity. As plants and animals are closely connected through the food web, deforestation reduces the biodiversity. Because of course deforestation is going to cause loss of wildlife, And since everything is so closely connected, the key word being interdependence, that means that other organisms that rely on those organisms will also reduce their population. Climate change. The trees and plants of the Amazon basin absorb carbon dioxide during the process of photosynthesis. If there are fewer trees and plants due to deforestation, then less carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere. And finally, economic development. This one is often forgotten about because people are always thinking of the negatives, but this is the one positive of deforestation. The creation of mines, farms, and roads, which caused deforestation, has also led to economic development for the Amazonian countries. And looking at a 9 marker. For a hot desert environment or a cold environment, depending on what you've studied, assess the importance of management strategies used to reduce the risk of environmental damage. So here are the broad strategies that can be used. Now you need to, depending on the ones that you've learnt, the case studies that you've looked at, you need to accompany and supplement each of these points with those statistics. So going over them broadly, the use of advanced technology for heating and transportation, especially in cold environments, so that you're not causing thawing. Sustainable resource management practices, limiting tourism to reduce environmental impact. For example, in the areas of America which are really cold, what they do is they limit the number of ships that can access those very cold areas so that they don't end up actually causing pollution into the water and disturbing the wildlife too much. Policies to protect indigenous communities and wildlife in these climates as well, because they are an important way of maintaining sustainability, not harming the indigenous communities. Okay, and we are now on to section C, physical UK landscapes. I hope you've enjoyed this video so far, and if you have any questions, do comment them down below. So, this is where there's a divide further, so you do rivers or you do coasts. So we're going to answer the last question from both topics. So for rivers, we're going to answer, explain the formation of a mudflat or salt marsh. So pause the video to answer the question. If not, let's go. Mudflats form when silt and mud are brought in by seas, oceans, and tributaries. The mud and the silt are deposited into bays and lagoons when the tide comes in. The water mixes with the mud and silt, creating the muddy quicksand that occurs in mudflats. Okay, and looking at the coasts 4 marker, explain how soft engineering or hard engineering can prevent erosion. So we started off by defining soft engineering. It's where the natural environment is used to help reduce coastal erosion and river flooding. At the cost of soft engineering, at the coast, soft engineering is where a beach is used to absorb wave energy and reduce erosion. So an example of this is beach nourishment, which is when they pretty much bring sand and put it onto a beach. Advantages is that it is aesthetically pleasing and looks natural. It doesn't look like these massive boulders you have with hard engineering. Disadvantages, however, it requires constant replacement. The sand has to be brought in from elsewhere. Now let's look at a 6 marker, the final question of this video. Explain how landforms are created by erosion or deposition. So you can see that I've put 4 different erosional landforms. However, this is a 6 marker. So if this was more of a higher mark question, then perhaps you'd be able to give this much depth. But in this case, you only need to mention maybe 2 or 3. So headlands and bays, as erosion takes place, the more resistant rock remains to form a headland and the less resistant rock erodes to create a bay. Bays are inlets within the rocky coastline that curve inland. Found either side of headlands, they are composed of weaker, less resistant rock. Bonus points if you are able to name those types of rock. Caves. Over time, through abrasion and hydraulic action as well, waves erode into the sides of the headlands, carving out a cave. This can happen on either side of the headland or even on both sides at the same time, and that will then create an arch. So for arches, stacks, and stumps, this is effectively an extension of the cave due to continued erosion. Wave cut platforms. Destructive waves hit against the cliff face. Hopefully you know what destructive waves are. If not, I would recommend watching my video about that. This causes an undercut between the high and low watermarks, mainly as a result of abrasion, corrosion, and hydraulic action, creating a wave cut notch, which is kind of like a little gap in between. This notch then enlarges into a cave, and that eventually forms a wave cut platform over a long period of time. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this live/video helpful, feel free to subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure you share this resource with all your friends. If you have any questions, do comment them down below. Thank you again so much for watching, and see you tomorrow. Bye for now.